So anywhere that there's a disparity out there in the ether, it's racist, which is why critical race theory is dangerous, because there's no way around not creating a disparity without forcing something upon somebody. And at that point, you lose American ideals like liberty, like equality, like prosperity. So this is very damaging because you remove those from the equation when you're dealing with critical race theory. Welcome to the Bald Brad Show. Before we get into our story today, please take a moment right now to hit that like and subscribe button. It really does help support the channel, and it also allows us to grow here at the Bald Brad Show, so your help would be greatly appreciated. With that being said, our story of the day is about critical race theory. What the heck is critical race theory, and how the leftists describe critical race theory compared to a conservative. So I have a video first to show you that's more of a reaction and kind of me talking and giving my commentary in between about what critical race theory is, and this is going to come and be described by a leftist Berkeley professor, Prudence Carter, and then I'll have Ben Shapiro's article coming up next to show how destructive this ideology is and how it goes against American ideals, and we'll have quotes from the actual founders of CRT, and we'll see the differences between the two and see how this lady kind of manipulates things. Let's go ahead and start the video.
Let's just start with a basic definitional question. When you hear critical race theory over and over again, what should people understand? How do you define CRT?
So I first want to just make a distinction between CRT, which is a theoretical framework that I learned in graduate school and read about in graduate school, versus teaching about race and racism in American history critically. So critical race theory is a framework. It's a theoretical framework that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to help us understand how it is that structural and racial disparities endure in our society, and how that is actually engendered in some of our laws and policies. And so the idea was to get us to think systemically, as opposed to just thinking that racism manifests by individuals just mistreating each other.
I just want to pause the video here just for a moment, because critical race theorist proponents as well as leftists talk about racism in this way all the time. The fact that there's a disparity out there in the ether, or a disparity in economics or wages or racial disparities, whatever the disparity is, that somehow in some way, shape, or form it has to do with racism. There couldn't possibly be any other reason for that disparity to exist other than racism, regardless of whether that racism was conscious or unconscious. This stuff is extremely destructive because of the fact of whether it's conscious or unconscious. They're just wholeheartedly saying that racism is the deciding factor of that disparity, and whatever institution is causing that disparity, whether that's a law or a workplace, again, or whatever institution, then that institution needs to be destroyed. And we'll see that in the Ben Shapiro article in a moment. But let's continue here with the video.
That there are actual structures in our society that create these different kinds of racial gaps and racial disparities economically, in terms of housing, in terms of education. And so that's what they do, is that they actually show us how the law, how laws that are supposed to be neutral actually can promulgate or support racial disparities. That's a theoretical framework. I think what we're talking about today, though, is some contestation and conflict over how you teach about race, racial hierarchies, critically, racism in schools and society. And so the two are being conflated.
The two are not conflated. You just got done saying that racism can be attributed to disparities, and that any institution that creates a disparity is racist, which is why you use the term systemic racism. And you also gave a legal analysis of the whole situation by saying there's laws on the books that are supposed to be neutral, but those laws lead to disparities. Thus, those laws are racist within themselves. So anywhere that there's a disparity out there in the ether, it's racist, which is why critical race theory is dangerous, because there's no way around not creating a disparity without forcing something upon somebody. And at that point, you lose American ideals like liberty, like equality, like prosperity. So this is very damaging because you remove those from the equation when you're dealing with critical race theory. But I digress. Let's continue.
And so when you hear people talking repeatedly about critical race theory, what is your thought?
Well, I hear people talking about critical race theory. I see that as a straw man for many communities, politicians particularly, trying to shape the knowledge base and what we teach students. I think that there is some fear about raising consciousness about structural inequality, about structural racism, because it does implicate many of our practices in our society. It indicates what we would have to do differently in government. And some of that is ideological in terms of there's a lot of resistance to how we do things to be fairer and more just in our society.
So there's a lot to unpack with what she just said, but I'm going to allow the Ben Shapiro article here to do my talking for me. It's coming from the Marshall News Messenger. Ben titles it, "The Movement Against Critical Race Theory is Deeply Necessary." Ben starts off by saying, according to the establishment media, critical race theory, or CRT, is a distraction. It is a right-wing smear. It is a conservative attempt to quash the dark side of American history. Most of all, according to the establishment media, you must never, ever pay attention to the infusion of CRT into the nation's institutions of power. According to MSNBC, controversy over CRT is a creation. It keeps people watching, or it keeps people clicking. According to CNN, CRT is just America's history. According to the Washington Post, those who criticize CRT are merely attempting to prevent us from learning our history. Critical race theory, of course, is not America's actual history. It is a perverse worldview unstoppable by the evidence in which all of America's key institutions are rooted in white supremacy. It is an activist campaign demanding the destruction of those institutions. The founders of CRT have written as much. According to the CRT founders, CRT is founded on two key premises: that racism is ordinary, not aberrational, normal science, the usual way of society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Second, that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material. Well, what does all this mean? This means, according to the founders, that racism is difficult to cure or address, and that a formal commitment to legal equality on the basis of colorblindness is merely a guise for further discrimination. Furthermore, CRT founders say that whites are unable to understand racism, and that minority status brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. That's an actual quote from the founders. CRT therefore holds that racism is embedded deeply in American life, unconsciously in the white American psyches, and that it is impossible for white Americans to understand that their own racism or that of the system, let alone to remove it. The only solution, folks, is tearing away the only systems that we have ever provided widespread liberty and prosperity, which is what I just talked about. What she's promoting here, the idea that the legal system, our governmental systems, our institutions are producing disparities. Well, the only way to get rid of those disparities is to force some sort of interaction or force some sort of people to produce some sort of outcome that would get rid of those disparities. At that point, you have to get rid of freedom. You have to get rid of our rights as private citizens. As fellow CRT founder Derek Bell wrote, the whole liberal worldview of private rights and public sovereignty mediated by the rule of law needed to be exploded, which is what I literally just said. It has to be removed. That's the only way of fixing this stuff. So you're seeing how and why this is so destructive to our American ideals, to the American dream. CRT isn't merely a tool of legal analysis either, as many of its dishonest defenders claim, which is what the professor was talking about in the first half of the video. The founders are clear. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists. Political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an active dimension. So what has CRT accomplished? The near complete subjugation of our higher educational system, which now traffics regularly in the CRT-related theories, the corruption of our establishment media, who parrot the anti-Americanism of CRT as just history, the infusion of CRT into nearly every area of the government under the Biden-esque newspeak of equity. And yet, if Americans notice this, if Americans lobby school boards to bar indoctrination in the cultish nonsense of CRT, these institutional actors tell those Americans that there is nothing to see. It's no big deal. It's not a problem. We're just teaching race racism, racial disparities, racial inequities, racial equity inside the classroom. We've been doing this for years. We're just going to kind of change it up a bit in the history course. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal because you're teaching that America is systemically racist when it's not. You're teaching the fact that just because there's disparities out there, that somehow there's racism out there in the ether. And if you don't recognize that racism, it's unconscious. You just haven't seen it yet because you're blind. It says here, ending off, we all have to fight those who have hijacked and weaponized our institutions against all these traditionally American ideals. Anything less would be an abdication of the trust we have been given, a trust that has resulted in liberty, equality, and prosperity beyond imagining for nearly all of human history. And that's what I talked about as my comment on what she talked about in the first half of the video, about the whole idea that, every institution is racist because it performs some sort of disparity. And to get rid of the disparities, you have to get rid of liberty, equality, and prosperity. So it completely removes and destructs the whole American foundation that the founders wanted, which was equality, that all men are created equal, that all men are created equal in God's image. But they don't believe in that type of stuff. They think just the fact that there's a disparity out there, racism. Racism is the key factor to everything out there in the ether. And if we get rid of those institutions, if we crumble them down, then those disparities will be removed. Well, it's a shock, folks. Even if you destroy those institutions, if you got rid of them, it's human nature to produce some sort of disparity. And that disparity does not have to be attributed to racism at all. But the left want it to be racism because that's the Democratic vote. And they need the Democratic vote. If they don't have the Democratic vote, then it's over. It's game over when people start realizing that institutions out there aren't racist. When people start realizing that America is the least racist country that's ever existed in humankind. But they don't want to agree with that because, again, if they keep that metaphorical plantation there, then there's people that are going to vote Democrat. If they keep having government being baby daddy, then the government is ultimately going to produce the votes that are going to go Democrat. So it's only going to sit there and make things worse if this goes into our education system. If we allow our children to be indoctrinated in the elementary school, middle school, and high school levels, rather than just the freaking college level, university level, we're going to see massive problems here in this country. And I'm going to go as far to say, if this gets pushed into our school system, starting at elementary, middle school, and high school levels, you're going to see America is not going to cease to exist with these ideals that we've been given by our Father God, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're not going to have those at all because people are going to think that the institutions that ultimately carry those and withhold those values need to be removed because they're producing some sort of disparity. I could talk hours on this, folks, but thank you so much for watching this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time here on The Bald Brad Show.